Now I'm honored to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Cullen Hendrix. Dr. Hendrix is a professor at the Korbel School of International Studies, University of Denver, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and senior research advisor at the Center for Climate and Security. He also holds research appointments at several other institutes, including the Network for Educational Research and Peace and Sustainability. Dr. Hendrix has broad interest in contentious politics, the political economy of development, and environmental politics. At the Korbel School, he leads the Environment, Food, and Conflict Lab, which leverages collaborations between physical and social scientists and policymakers to produce scholarship and analysis on issues at the intersection of environment, food security, and conflict. He has published extensively in high-profile journals in the field and is associate editor of the Journal of Peace Research. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Hendrix to start his presentation. So Dr. Hendrix, the floor is yours, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ayub. It's a pleasure to be with you all today in the morning for you and what is the early evening for me. I would like to thank all the members of the NERPS network and the staff, especially the director, right, Kaneko-sensei, for the honor of being asked to speak as part of this lecture series. It really, truly is an honor. I had the pleasure of getting to visit Hiroshima University in August of last year as part of the Hiroshima Dialogue on the Sustainability Peace Nexus in the context of global change. And I have to tell you, I knew almost instantly that I wanted to be a member of the team and commit my own efforts to furthering what I think is NERP's kind of mission out there, which is creating a peaceful and sustainable global society in the context of global environmental change. It's very consonant with my interest, and I'm so fortunate to be part of it. I very much look forward to returning in person, this time with my family, as soon as COVID-19 allows. Today, I'm going to be talking about a project I'm undertaking as part of this cross-appointed researcher program at Hiroshima University, which asks whether multilateral institutions and governance strategies can help prevent conflict and promote shared management of our oceans fisheries. But before doing that, I would actually like to reflect a little and acknowledge the comments that Dr. Jeffrey Sachs gave in the opening remarks of this series, which were extremely well taken, and you can find them on the web if you would like to revisit those. They were obviously very thoughtful, and they were, befitting a scholar of his renown, his breadth, his passion, and his vast knowledge. And I was particularly excited about his discussion of the transformative impact of technology as a mechanism for achieving sustainable development that is particularly relevant for those regions and those parts of the world that have not benefited from the past, say, couple of centuries of economic development that unfortunately have also contributed greatly to the global environmental change that we are seeing now. But if Sachs kind of focused his comments on a relatively new relationship between humans and their environment and peace and sustainability driven by this new technological innovation, I'm going to focus my comments on a relationship that seemingly as old as humanity itself, and that is between humans and the oceans. As early as 50,000 years ago, humans were already engaged in long-distance sea travel. And I'm going to be sharing my screen intermittently because I have a few images I would like to share with you. So this is the first one. And humans were fishing the oceans almost at that point from rafts and early boats long before we even began domesticating animals or engaging in agriculture. And so this is the oldest known fish hook in the world. This is from a piece that was published in Science about a decade ago. And it was discovered at this field site near Jaramalai in East Timor. And it dates back to 23,000 years ago. And that's a really astounding time frame. That's a long time in the prehistory of humanity, until you realize that the other fossilized evidence that they found there indicates that the practice may have been going on for 17,000 years prior to that. That's truly incredible. And we're not just talking about fish that they might have been eating out of streams, or maybe fish that hug the coastlines for their environment. They were fishing the ancestors of the tuna and shark that are still coveted today. So this is definitely something that has been with us for a long time. And today, these oceans are no less important. They provide food and livelihood security for at least a billion people, millions of whom they provide direct income. especially in the developing world. And demand for fish is going nowhere but up, as the emerging global middle class of 3 billion people wants to enjoy the benefits of a more diverse animal protein-based diet. Oceans facilitate 90% of world trade through the global shipping industry, and they're a source of cultural heritage and identity for coastal communities and nations across the globe. Now, this is especially true of Japan, which is only the 62nd largest country by land area, but has the world's 6th longest coastline. Now, all apologies to anime, but sushi is by far Japan's most universally celebrated cultural export. The iconic Great Wave off Kanagawa is perhaps the most instantly recognizable piece of Japanese art in the world. But these connections are not unique to Japan. The oceans captivate our imaginations. They force us to confront both our sense of infinite possibilities and actually the smallness of our own individual lives. They represent the final frontier in many ways, and they are by far the most vast of the known, but largely ungoverned spaces on Earth. They were here before us, they have been part of us since the beginning, and they will outlast us. But the oceans that outlast us may be very different from the ones that we have experienced and benefited from. These oceans are in fact in crisis. Much like the global atmosphere, the vastness of the world's oceans and the ecosystems they support hide significant vulnerabilities, many of which are directly created or exacerbated by human behavior. These crises affect coastal communities and ecosystems, including mangrove forests and coral reefs, very directly. But my principal focus will be on the crisis facing the ocean's fisheries. Humans are in the process of fishing out many of the world's capture fisheries, which focus on wild-caught fish. Though ocean fisheries aren't usually discussed in these terms, it's important to remember that they present the last major wild source of food left in the global food system. Humans regulate most of their food sources by planting or encouraging or limiting reproduction in the case of animal populations, and then by harvesting them. But with wild-caught fish, humans simply have choices about how many to harvest and how. We only control half of the system, at best. And these wild populations are under very significant stress. So these data are from the Sea Around Us project at the University of British Columbia and help us understand the magnitude of the issue. Their project is invaluable for many reasons, but in part it's because they are seeking to provide what we might call a true cost accounting of total fish catch, including things like discards of non-desired species that occur at sea and are never reported, or known cases of massive underreporting, such as China's underreporting of catches by its far ocean fleets. The work of the Sea Around Us has yielded a variety of very important insights, but among the most important is that actual global catch has far outstripped the reported catch since at least the 1950s, with the gap widening significantly since the 1970s. So it was worse than we thought. The black line here represents the total reported catch to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, right? So that's what we thought was going on. Their reconstruction tells us that at any given point, fishing effort and fish landings were anywhere from 40 to 50% higher than what was actually being reported and what actually already seemed to be auguring towards crisis. Now, the second, which is perhaps even more alarming, is that it indicates that global catch peaked in 1996. Global fisheries have been in slow decline for nearly 25 years. And now there's a boom in global aquaculture, so that's fish farming, that has helped to offset some of these declines in catch, at least as a source of animal protein. But many prized fish species are either unsuitable for fish farming or are unsuitable at the scale that would be necessary to completely offset these declining catches. Fundamentally, most ocean fisheries are considered to be either already fully or overexploited, with catches surpassing what fishery scientists call maximum sustainable yield, the maximum amount that can be caught before the fish population goes into decline, losing its ability to reproduce and sustain itself over time. And it's important to know that when these fisheries go into decline, they don't just decline, they often collapse completely. The decline is not gradual, rather, in many instances, it's like falling off of a cliff. For example, the Northwest Atlantic cod fishery went from producing roughly 600,000 tons in 1990 to virtually nothing just 2 years later. And fisheries scientists are not nearly as good at forecasting these collapses as we might hope that they would be. Much like financial crises, we typically only recognize them once the damage has already been done. And the damage done to fish populations in just 2 or 3 years can take decades to rebound, if they ever rebound at all. So right now, it's fair to say that global fishing practices are unsustainable. Now, to this already troubling picture regarding ocean fisheries, we can add the effects of global climate change. Climate change will impact the oceans in many, many complex ways that are far too numerous for us to cover today. But the most important is ocean warming. Like all organisms, fish are adapted to specific environments, both due to their preferred diets and to their physiology. So some thrive in warm waters, while others are adapted to colder environments. The fish that thrive in the warm waters around the Philippines would die in the cold waters north of Hokkaido, and vice versa. Global warming is causing temperatures in the ocean to rise, a process that is actually already well underway. This chart shows increases in average sea surface temperature during the 20th and early 21st centuries. And what it shows is that virtually the entirety of global oceans are experiencing significant warming trends. The little hashes, the little plus signs, let you know which of these areas are the ones where scientists are most confident that the trends are not due to random variation. So it's a fairly broad picture and firm consensus that the oceans are in fact warming. Now, unlike the terrestrial space, our oceans do not have hardened borders, which means fish are free to migrate in search of more livable conditions. And this process is already occurring. It's affecting the migration patterns of highly migratory stocks like tuna, sharks, and swordfish, but also of more sedentary stocks that stay in a relatively small confined location like lobster or maybe crab in many instances. And while ocean borders are not hardened in the same way that land borders are, they still exist. And most fishing activity takes place within these marine borders. These borders are known as exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, in which coastal countries have jurisdiction over the exploration and harvesting or extraction of marine resources. These EEZs extend 200 nautical miles, or about 370 kilometers, from the shoreline. Now, a few major fishing nations like Taiwan, South Korea, Spain, China, and Japan have far ocean fleets that range pretty far and wide, essentially all over the globe. But most countries' fishers, and thus their livelihoods, depend on resources located within or near their EEZ. Beyond those EEZs, for all intents and purposes, anything goes. These are areas that are open access and free to be harvested by any vessel from any country. There's no unified regime for governing these open ocean spaces. Now, you can probably see where this is going. The combination of climate change-induced fish migration and the EEZ-based regime for governing the oceans is and will continue to create winners and losers moving forward. Now, one more share. Now, this chart shows forecast changes in maximum catch potential, or potential catch at maximum sustainable yield, so how much we think will be able to be sustainably harvested moving forward, for 280 EEZs by the mid-century under what is known as the business as usual high emissions climate change scenario, or RCP 8.5, for those of you who are familiar with those different scenarios. Now, the news is mostly bad, particularly for countries fishing in the already heavily fished waters in and around Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, which may see that their EEZs reduced in productivity by up to 40 to 50%. It's only at extremely high latitudes near the poles that fisheries potential is expected to increase significantly. So fish are going to be moving north and south in search of cooler climates. And it's not just the climate change effects in the water that actually matter. The negative effects of climate change on agricultural livelihoods on land are actually increasing pressure on fisheries by encouraging migration away from rural agricultural areas and towards the oceans and lake shores in search of better livelihood prospects, leading to more fishers attempting to chase fewer fish. So the combination of dwindling fisheries, climate change-induced changes in fisheries productivity, and increasing demand for fish is raising concerns that fisheries will become a major source of conflict in the future. Writing in 2017, no less an expert on war and peace than former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis, said ominously, "The fishing wars are coming." Stavridis, along with co-author Johan Bergenes, warned in particular that Chinese fishing practices were becoming increasingly militarized in the South China Sea, but more widely as well, referring to it as nothing short of hybrid warfare, and a potential spark for wider armed conflicts. And the South China Sea is not the only place fisheries are becoming a source of conflict. From conflict between India and Sri Lanka and the Laccadive Sea to the Persian Gulf and even the English Channel, disputes over fisheries have turned violent, resulting in damaged or scuttled vessels, arrested and imprisoned fishers, and even deaths in some occurrences. Now, all due respect to Admiral Stavridis, but fisheries conflict is not an entirely new phenomenon. Capture fisheries are a common pool resource. What this means is that a fish I catch is one that you cannot catch. Moreover, it's one less fish to go about procreating and creating more fish to sustain the population. Competing claims on these kind of fisheries resources are omnipresent, and many conflicts over fisheries revolve around access rights. Who is allowed to make use of the fishery? How much are they allowed to harvest? And how are they allowed to harvest? What kind of gear can they use? And especially in areas of limited formal governance, like the high seas, these claims are ultimately enforced by the threat or use of force. And we see violent conflict over fisheries resources at multiple spatial and governance scales. So these charts are from the Secure Fisheries Program at the One Earth Future Foundation in Colorado. Their team has been cataloging fisheries conflict in coastal East Africa. And the team has found that a large number of these conflicts are either within or between fishing communities, or between fishing communities and local officials. They are not wars in the conventional sense. In Tanzania, for example, these conflicts are primarily driven by the issue of access rights. Who gets to fish where, and what kind of gears can they use? As some fishing techniques are much more harmful to fish populations than others. And these conflicts don't just occur in the oceans. The African Great Lakes region, which is outlined here in red, sees many fisheries conflicts on inland lakes. However, it is interstate fisheries conflicts that are the ones that drive kind of broader international security concerns and threats to global peace. Now, earlier this year, I was part of a team led by Beth Mendenhall at the University of Rhode Island that looked at fisheries-related interstate disputes involving the military use of force over the past several decades. And what we found was very interesting. Roughly 1 in 10 of all militarized disputes that occurred in those past several decades were related to fisheries. This map that is in the resulting article from that collaboration, it's in Marine Policy, overlays the locations of these disputes with the catch potential data that you might remember from just a couple slides ago. The geographic trends in historical conflict and change in catch potential imply a large potential for fisheries conflict continuing in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia in the near term, where productivity is declining, but also increasing potential for these kind of conflicts in the Arctic, where catch potential is forecast to increase significantly under climate change. That is, we may see conflicts driven by both scarcity dynamics, where the actors fight over a dwindling resource base, and abundance dynamics, where fisheries and the fleets compete to harvest newly productive polar fisheries. Now, these conflicts are typically quite contained, and the vast majority of them do not even involve loss of life, but rather hostile boardings, boat confiscations, arrests, or even destruction of fishing boats by naval or Coast Guard forces. However, these fisheries disputes represent true wildcard scenarios in the international security space. Most of the time, militarized disputes between sovereign states are initiated by the military forces of a sovereign state. Fisheries disputes are often initiated by the actions of fishing boats that may have a national identity in terms of their flagging or their crew, but they're not government actors most of the time. While fish would likely need to be one of several issues at the center of any major maritime conflict, they could create one of these wildcard scenarios in which competing navies are brought to the point of engagement by the actions of third parties, so the fishing vessels and in some instances, state-sponsored maritime militias, that they neither directly command or control. Under these circumstances, miscalculations or misunderstandings may spiral out of control quickly. And these disputes cluster in regions, including the South China Sea and the Gulf of Aden, where there are multiple already present conflict accelerants like piracy, the discovery of new energy resources, and rising military powers with regional ambitions and all of these things are overlaid in many of these parts of the world with forecasted declines in catch potential. So a dwindling resource base and increasing claims on that resource by an increasing number of actors. And these fisheries conflicts, I should mention, are not just between kind of minor powers in the international system. In the past 70 years, the most frequent adversaries in these conflicts have been Russia, Japan, China, and the United States. These are not peripheral countries in discussions of international security. So given this potentially grim kind of outlook, how can we transform the oceans from a new front in great power competition and geopolitical calculations, and rather transform them into a locus of peaceful interactions that can help repair and sustain the world's fisheries? Well, that's going to be the question I'm going to be interrogating via my position as a cross-appointed professor. And I look forward to hopefully reaching out to many of you across the Hiroshima campus to collaborate with you on this work and get to know more about your expertise as relevant for this exciting venture, and to help you understand, hopefully from a distance, more about the network itself. Now, via my project, I'm going to be looking at a potentially unlikely venue for mitigating and adjudicating and transforming these disputes: regional fisheries management organizations. Now, earlier, I made the comment that basically anything goes on the high seas outside of the EEZs. I was actually overstating the case a bit. It is not the case that these waters outside of the EEZs are completely ungoverned. Rather, they are governed collectively and collaboratively. Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, or RFMOs, are international organizations composed of countries that share a practical and economic interest in conserving fish stocks in a particular region. And these regions are often incredibly vast. The 5 major RFMOs that cover highly migratory and valuable species like tuna and swordfish and large billfish collectively cover 91% of the world's oceans. Notably, the areas with least comprehensive coverage are near the poles, reflecting historically their inaccessibility and remoteness, even for the Arctic countries. Now let's look really briefly at one such RFMO. This is the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, or the WCPFC. It's headquartered in Micronesia. Now, the extent of this RFMO is truly massive, covering more than half of the Pacific Ocean. The member states here are depicted in the dark gray, as opposed to the light gray, which are non-member states. Now, this RFMO does not supersede the jurisdiction of the EEZs that fall within its mandated area of coverage. Rather, like the other large RFMOs, it serves mainly as a coordinating body. Scientists from member states get together and analyze data on the fisheries resources and establish sustainable catch levels for the various included species that they govern. Then the RFMO helps to coordinate individual member state policies to keep their country's fishing fleets within the agreed limits. RFMOs also have subcommittee structures that address issues like monitoring compliance with agreements and bringing RFMO practices in line with best practices as established by current research. Now, in my last few minutes here, I'll give 3 reasons why we might think this unlikely type of international organization, the RFMO, might be a vehicle for addressing fisheries conflict and promoting peace and sustainable management of this shared resource. And I'm going to move from the most kind of abstract of those reasons to the most concrete. Now, first, as international institutions, joint membership in these bodies tends on margin to pacify relations between states, even if the organizations are not specifically mandated to do so. There's now a large body of literature on the peace-promoting effects of participation in international organizations. One of the most interesting findings is that membership in international institutions or organizations can have powerful effects for state behavior, even when the organizations in question have nothing to do with the specific issue at hand. So on margin, just being members of these international organizations seems to socialize states into international norms, in particular the norms governing the use of force to settle disputes. Now, second, these kind of co-management institutions temper the high politics of statecraft by providing a regular arena for what I would call the low politics of resource management. Heads of state and their cabinets face a variety of incentives, and they have competing claims on their actions and public positions. Moreover, they're responsible for gaining and maintaining political support. It's how they got to be leaders in the first place, right? For this reason, they tend to see environmental issues as a tool of broader statecraft, a leverage point in negotiations, or a chip to be traded for concessions on some other issue. In contrast, The kinds of people who wind up attending RFMO meetings are generally nerds, and I mean that in the absolute best sense possible, right? They're often highly trained technicians with an unglamorous job to do. And they wouldn't be doing this unglamorous job if they didn't fundamentally care about the resources they are managing. As such, in times of tension, they can reach out to one another as scientific colleagues and friends, rather than as government officials, or at the very least combine both of those identities and bring them to the table in negotiations. Now, we see this dynamic in a variety of co-management arrangements, ranging from those that govern the mountain gorillas in Central Africa to transboundary river management, which we actually see on all the continents except for Australia and the Arctic and Antarctica. It's one of the reasons scientists are so often part of what's known as track 2 or unofficial diplomatic efforts. Our identities as scientists can supersede our identities as nationals of whatever country we happen to represent. And I want to be clear, the operations of these RFMOs are not entirely apolitical. They are influenced by politics, as are any interactions between representatives of sovereign states. I'm just suggesting that there are other ways in which the interactions between these professionals are structured that might make them more conducive to easing tensions in times of extreme stress. And finally, RFMOs could, pending some institutional reforms, actually play a significant role in resolving these disputes, or at least specifying alternative mechanisms by which these disputes can be resolved. Currently, no RFMO has a formal process for dispute resolution, though most are at least rhetorically committed to promoting peaceful resolution of disputes among member states. We know from research on transboundary river treaties, which is another common pool resource that can be a potential spark for interstate conflict, that these treaties help resolve conflict peacefully by either establishing rules governing bilateral dispute resolution, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time a crisis emerges, or referring the matter to an international body with greater enforcement power, like for instance, the International Court of Justice. This last mechanism would require significant revisions to the structure of these organizations. But these measures may be warranted if they help to prevent a future of widespread fisheries conflicts. I'm extremely excited to be part of this NERPS venture. I think it's a wonderful team that is being put together here. And I think it is going to be done in the spirit of international scientific collaboration that is going to not just transcend global boundaries, but also transcend our disciplinary boundaries. This work that I'm going to be doing is inherently multi and interdisciplinary. And if you're familiar with my work at all, you might know that I've had the fortunate opportunity to collaborate as often with natural resource managers and oceanographers and physicists and systems analysts as I have other political scientists. So as I come to Hiroshima and join the network, I look forward to reaching out to people across the Hiroshima campus to identify partnerships and areas of shared interest from which we can move forward in helping to create a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. Thank you very much.